Something fundamental is shifting inside one of the oldest institutions on Earth. You can feel it in the way the royal family communicates now compared to how it communicated 20 years ago. You can see it in the faces that appear at official engagements and in the causes that get royal endorsement, and in the language that comes out of palace press offices when the world is watching and waiting to understand what the monarchy thinks about something difficult and complicated and real. The British monarchy is changing, not at the speed that its critics would prefer, and not in ways that will satisfy everyone who has reasons to be dissatisfied with it, but changing nonetheless, in ways that are genuine and that reflect something more than the cosmetic adjustments that institutions sometimes make to create the appearance of evolution without any of the substance. The change is real. Understanding what is driving it, what shape it is taking, and where it might ultimately lead requires looking at the institution honestly, with neither the uncritical reverence that some people bring to conversations about the monarchy, nor the reflexive hostility that others have decided is the only appropriate response to it. The place to begin is with what the monarchy actually was in its relatively recent past, because the contrast with what it is becoming is where the change becomes most visible and most meaningful. For most of the 20th century, the British monarchy operated according to a philosophy that could be summarized fairly simply. The institution existed above the ordinary world. Its members were not quite ordinary people, and the way they presented themselves to the public reflected that separation. Emotions were contained. Private life was private in a way that was absolute and non-negotiable. Communication with the public happened through formal channels, through official announcements and managed press releases, and carefully staged public appearances where nothing was left to chance and nothing unscripted was permitted to surface. The institution spoke in a single voice, and that voice was always calm and always measured and always somehow remote, always located at a slight distance from the messy human realities that it was observing and occasionally commenting upon, but never actually inhabiting in any visible way. This philosophy had real strengths. It gave the monarchy a quality of dignity and consistency that generated genuine respect. It protected the individuals inside the institution from the most intrusive forms of public scrutiny. It created a kind of mystique that was itself a source of the monarchy's power and appeal, because things that are partially hidden and partially revealed have always been more compelling than things that are entirely transparent. And it worked in the specific sense that the institution survived and maintained public support through decades of enormous social change, through the loss of empire and the transformation of British society and the emergence of a media environment that was increasingly aggressive and increasingly difficult to manage. But it also had real costs, and those costs accumulated over time in ways that eventually became impossible to ignore. The most significant cost was human. The philosophy of emotional containment and institutional primacy meant that the people inside the monarchy were expected to subordinate everything personal, everything individual, everything that made them human beings rather than symbols, to the needs and the image of the institution. When that expectation was met, the result was the kind of dignified composure that Queen Elizabeth II represented so consistently and so impressively. When it was not met, or when the gap between the institutional expectation and the human reality became too large to bridge, the result was suffering that the institution had no framework for acknowledging or addressing. Diana is the unavoidable example, the case that demonstrated most dramatically what the system could do to someone who did not fit its requirements. But she was not the only example, just the most visible and the most consequential. The history of the royal family in the 20th century contains other stories of individuals whose personal needs and personal realities were overridden by institutional demands, stories that received less attention because the individuals involved were either less prominent or less willing to speak about what they had experienced. The system had been designed to protect the institution, and it was very effective at that. What it had not been designed to do, and what it consistently failed to do, was protect the people. The death of Diana in 1997 was the moment when that failure became impossible for the public to ignore. The outpouring of grief that followed her death was not just grief for a woman who had been loved. It was, at a deeper level, a kind of public reckoning with the way the institution had treated her, a collective acknowledgement that something had gone wrong that should not have gone wrong, and that the people responsible for it were going to have to account for themselves in some way. The royal family's initial response to her death, the decision to remain in Scotland, the refusal to engage publicly with the scale of the public mourning, was the last gasp of the old philosophy, the final attempt to manage an unmanageable situation through the tools of institutional distance and emotional reserve. It failed completely. The pressure that built up in those days was unlike anything the monarchy had faced in living memory, and the eventual response, the Queen's return to London, the broadcast address to the nation, the public acknowledgement of Diana's significance, represented something genuinely new. For the first time in modern memory, the institution had been forced to respond to public emotion rather than simply observing it from a distance. That moment did not immediately transform the monarchy. Institutions do not change overnight, and the specific individuals in positions of authority at the time were people who had been formed by the old philosophy and who were not naturally inclined to abandon it simply because it had failed in one very public instance. But it planted a seed. It demonstrated in a way that could not subsequently be under-discussed or explained away that the old approach had limits, that there were moments when the public demand for human connection and human acknowledgement was stronger than the institution's preference for composed distance, and that failing to respond to those moments had consequences that could not be absorbed without genuine cost. The generation that has grown up in the shadow of Diana's life and death, and specifically the two sons she left behind, has been the primary vehicle for whatever genuine change has happened in the monarchy since then. William and Harry grew up inside the institution that had, in various ways, failed their mother, and they responded to that inheritance in ways that were shaped by their individual temperaments and experiences, but that both reflected a different relationship to the old philosophy than the generation before them had maintained. Harry, in the most dramatic way, ultimately rejected that philosophy entirely and chose transparency and personal freedom over institutional loyalty in a manner that has no real precedent in the history of the modern monarchy. William has taken a more measured path, but even his approach to his role reflects assumptions about the relationship between public service and personal authenticity that would have seemed quite foreign to the generation that preceded him. The most visible dimension of the changing face of the monarchy is the engagement with mental health, which has become one of the central causes associated with the younger generation of royals, and which represents a departure from the old philosophy that is both symbolic and substantive. The Heads Together campaign, launched by William, Harry, and Catherine in 2016, was built around a simple but radical idea for an institution with the monarchy's history. The idea that talking about mental health struggles, acknowledging them publicly, removing the stigma from them, was not a sign of weakness but a form of strength and service. The campaign asked people to start conversations about mental health that they had previously avoided, and it did this by having members of the royal family start those conversations themselves by speaking in public about their own experiences with grief and anxiety and the psychological weight of their positions. For William to speak publicly about the grief he experienced after his mother's death, about the years he spent not processing it and the consequences of that avoidance, was a departure from everything the old philosophy would have permitted. For Harry to speak about his own mental health struggles, about the therapy he eventually sought, and the difference it made, was even more so. These were not managed institutional communications in the traditional sense. They were personal disclosures, offered in a spirit of genuine vulnerability, and they connected with people in ways that the old style of royal communication simply never could have. The response was significant and measurable. The conversations that the campaign generated, the reduction in stigma that surveys suggested it helped to produce, the sheer number of people who reported that hearing a member of the royal family speak about mental health had made it easier for them to seek help themselves, demonstrated that this kind of engagement had real-world consequences beyond the symbolic dot. The engagement with race is another dimension of the changing face of the monarchy, and it is the most complicated and the most contested of the changes that are currently underway. The British monarchy's relationship with race is inseparable from its relationship with empire, and the history of the British Empire is a history that contains things of genuine grandeur and things of genuine horror, and that cannot be understood honestly without engaging with both. The extraction of wealth from colonized nations, the systems of racial hierarchy that were used to justify and maintain colonial rule, the specific experiences of people whose ancestors lived under British imperial authority and were shaped in ways both obvious and subtle by that experience, these are not peripheral footnotes to the history of the institution. They are central to it, woven into the economic foundations on which the monarchy's wealth and power were built. For most of the 20th century, the British monarchy did not engage with this history in any public or direct way. The transition from empire to commonwealth was managed as a transition rather than a reckoning, as an evolution in relationships rather than a confrontation with what those relationships had actually been. The Commonwealth itself was and is a complicated institution, simultaneously a genuine forum for international cooperation and a structure that retains significant traces of the power imbalances that characterized the imperial relationship it notionally replaced. The monarchy's position at the center of the Commonwealth gave it a continuing connection to its imperial past and a continuing obligation to manage that connection in ways that served the institution's interests, which meant, most of the time, avoiding the most difficult questions about what that past had actually involved. What has changed, slowly and incompletely, and with significant controversy at every step, is a greater willingness to acknowledge that the history matters and that it cannot simply be managed away. King Charles's expressions of personal sorrow about the history of slavery during Commonwealth meetings, the acknowledgments in certain royal speeches of the painful dimensions of the colonial legacy, represent language that would simply not have been used by previous occupants of the throne. Whether that language is sufficient, whether it is accompanied by anything that constitutes genuine redress or genuine accountability, is a question that different people answer very differently, depending on their relationship to that history and their assessment of what genuine accountability would actually require. But the fact that the language is being used at all, that the institution has moved from complete silence on these questions to some form of public acknowledgement, is itself a change worth noting. The Harry and Meghan situation, and specifically the questions about race that it raised, pushed this dimension of the monarchy's evolution into the most public and the most uncomfortable territory it has yet occupied. The allegation that a member of the royal family had raised concerns about the skin color of Meghan's unborn child, aired in the Oprah interview in 2021, confronted the institution with a question about its own internal culture in a way that could not be deflected or managed in the normal ways. The palace's response was inadequate to the scale of the question, and the inadequacy was itself revealing, because it demonstrated that the institution's evolution on questions of race had not yet reached the point where it could engage honestly with the most direct and most personal dimensions of those questions as they affected its own members and its own culture. The ongoing evolution of the monarchy's relationship with the Commonwealth nations, particularly those in the Caribbean, that have been actively debating whether to retain the British monarch as head of state, is the most structurally significant dimension of this particular form of change. Barbados became a republic in 2021. Jamaica has been actively discussing following suit. Other nations are at various stages of the same conversation. Each departure or potential departure from the realm of nations that retain the British monarch as head of state raises questions about what the Commonwealth actually is and what holds it together if the monarchical connection is no longer the binding element. The monarchy's response to these conversations has been more thoughtful than a pure defense of the institutional status quo would have been, more genuinely acknowledging of the legitimacy of the choices that individual nations are making about their own constitutional arrangements. But the underlying challenge remains, and the changing face of the monarchy on this front is being shaped as much by choices made in Kingston and Bridgetown and other capitals as by choices made in London. The media strategy represents another significant dimension of change, one that is perhaps less philosophically dramatic than the engagement with mental health or race, but that has equally significant practical consequences for how the monarchy is perceived and how it operates in the contemporary world. The old media strategy, as already noted, relied on control and distance and the management of carefully limited access. It was effective in an era when the media landscape was relatively concentrated and when a relatively small number of newspapers and broadcasters could be managed through established relationships and mutual understandings. That era is gone. The contemporary media environment is characterized by fragmentation and speed, and the complete dissolution of the gatekeeping function that traditional media organizations once performed. Anyone with a phone and a social media account can now contribute to the public conversation about the royal family, and the volume and diversity of that contribution makes the old approach to management not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. The response to this changed environment has been gradually and sometimes reluctantly a move toward more direct communication. The Princess of Wales's cancer announcement video, recorded in a garden and delivered directly to camera without the mediation of a press conference or a formal statement, is the most dramatic example of what this shift looks like in practice. But it is part of a broader pattern that includes more active management of social media channels, more willingness to share personal glimpses of family life on royal terms rather than waiting for them to be captured and published without consent, and a greater general willingness to engage with the public in a register that feels human and accessible rather than formal and remote. The causes that the monarchy champions have also shifted in ways that reflect a changing understanding of what the institution's public role should involve. The environmental advocacy that King Charles has pursued for decades, which was considered eccentric and somewhat embarrassing by some observers when he was Prince of Wales, now looks prescient in a world where climate change has moved from a fringe concern to the defining challenge of the century. His ability to speak on environmental issues with genuine knowledge and genuine passion, grounded in decades of engagement rather than recently acquired talking points, gives him a credibility on this subject that is unusual for a public figure and that the institution has been gradually learning to deploy more effectively. The engagement with homelessness, with early childhood development, with the mental health of veterans, with the experiences of people living in the most economically disadvantaged parts of the United Kingdom. These are all areas where the current generation of working royals has been more actively and more visibly present than previous generations. The quality of that presence varies, And the question of whether royal advocacy for these causes produces anything beyond increased public awareness is a legitimate one. But the direction of travel is toward engagement with the concrete realities of people's lives rather than the symbolic and ceremonial functions that have traditionally been the monarchy's primary public role. The internal culture of the institution is the dimension of change that is hardest to observe from outside and probably the most important in terms of what the monarchy ultimately becomes. Institutions are made of people and systems and habits and assumptions, and changing those things requires sustained effort over time and genuine willingness to confront the fact that the way things have always been done is not necessarily the way they should continue to be done. There is evidence from people who have worked within the palace system and who have spoken about it with varying degrees of directness that the internal culture has been under pressure and that some of that pressure has produced real change. There is also evidence that the institutional habits of centuries do not dissolve quickly, that the resistance to change within the system is real and persistent, and sometimes overwhelming. The people who advise the royal family, the courtiers and communications professionals, and various institutional officials who constitute the staffing layer between the family and the world are in some respects the most important actors in the story of institutional change. They are the ones who translate the family's intentions into institutional practice, who manage the relationship between the private individuals and the public institution, who make the hundreds of small decisions every day that cumulatively determine what the monarchy looks like from the outside. Their culture and their assumptions and their willingness or unwillingness to change are as important as anything the family members themselves might want. What is reasonably clear is that the staffing and advisory structures have been changing, that there has been a conscious effort in recent years to bring in people with different backgrounds and different perspectives than the relatively homogeneous group that has traditionally populated the upper levels of the palace system. Whether this diversification of personnel has yet produced a genuine diversification of institutional culture and assumptions is a harder question, one that probably cannot be answered definitively from outside the institution and possibly cannot even be answered definitively from inside it. The succession and what it means for the pace and direction of change is the question that underlies all the others. King Charles has been on the throne for a relatively short time, and his approach to the role reflects the particular combination of his own long preparation, his genuine intellectual engagement with the issues he has championed, and his understanding of what the constitutional requirements of the position demand. William, as the next in line, represents a different generational perspective and a different set of formative experiences, shaped more directly by the media environment of the late 20th and early 21st century, and by the specific traumas and lessons of his own childhood and young adulthood. The monarchy that William will eventually lead will be different from the one he is inheriting, partly because of changes that are already underway, and partly because the world in which it will operate will itself be different in ways that are hard to predict. The Commonwealth will have evolved. The relationship between Britain and its former empire will have continued to be renegotiated. The media environment will have changed further. The public expectations of what transparency and accountability look like from a powerful institution will have shifted, and William will bring to the task his own particular combination of qualities and experiences and commitments, shaped by everything he has lived through and everything he has learned. The changing face of the British monarchy is not a completed project. It is a process, ongoing and unfinished, and shaped by forces both inside and outside the institution that are themselves constantly shifting. The changes that have happened are real and they matter. The changes that still need to happen are significant and they will be difficult. The institution is more human than it was, more willing to acknowledge the humanity of the people inside it and the humanity of the public it serves. It is more engaged with the real challenges of the contemporary world than it was, more willing to lend its unique platform to causes and conversations that have genuine urgency. It is more honest about the complexity of its own history than it was, more willing to look at the parts of that history that are not sources of pride. Whether all of this is enough, whether the pace of change is sufficient for the world the monarchy is operating in, whether the institution can ultimately make the deeper and more structural changes that would make it genuinely fit for the 21st century rather than just updated for it. These are questions that honest observers have to leave open. The monarchy has surprised people before, both by failing when it seemed most secure and by enduring when it seemed most vulnerable. What it is becoming in this particular moment of genuine transition may surprise people again. The face is changing. The question of what face it will ultimately wear is still being answered. One decision and one disclosure and one carefully chosen word at a time.